Welcome to Voices at the Table. My name is Sandra Organ Solis, and my husband Carlos and I have been hosting these discussions for um, this is our fifth one. I want to start before I do introductions. We recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or a historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build mindfulness of our present participation. So, again, welcome to Voices at the Table. For those of you who are new to this table, my name is Sandra Organ Solis. I'm a Black woman who heralds from two Native Texans, one of 7 children, raised Catholic in Omaha, Nebraska. I moved to Texas to become Houston Ballet's first Black ballerina, and after 15 years founded a nonprofit dance ensemble in Houston, Earth and Vessels, for which I was artistic and executive director. I've continued choreographing and teaching since moving to Central Texas 6 years ago with my husband, Dr. Carlos Solis, a native Guatemalan who came to Rice University, now at Texas State, and serves as Associate Vice President of its Technology Innovation Office. You can go to our Voices at the Table website to read how my husband and I came to this moment, find recordings of past panels, and find resources to further your learning about the topics and perspectives we have raised, but by no means have exhausted in these discussions. Carlos and I started this discussion panel as an anti-racist endeavor to bring light to the voices of color in our communities with their lived experiences and stories in hopes that they will create more awareness, more informed advocacy, more conversations, and some self-examination as to how you might be complicit in perpetuating systems that have historically oppressed others. While I am often wishing how much more we might explore these topics, I am hopeful that the new realizations birthed in walking someone else's worldview will inspire more discovery within yourself, more uncovering your bias, and more information to fuel your agency and advocacy. These are only some of the voices, aspects, and inroads we could explore. Next time, we will be reviewing these panels and asking from you, what is next? Please be patient, bring your ideas and aha moments. We will be celebrating Juneteenth. We will be in touch. Now for some table manners. These may be uncomfortable conversations to hear, and due to the sensitive nature of the topics at times, we ask that you please honor this listening space by staying muted. That being said, we welcome your use of the chat box. Memories will come to mind, thoughts will surface, and realizations will dawn. Please place comments, questions, and brief descriptions of anecdotes you have in the chat box, which the illustrious Lynn Flocky, if she will wave her hand, will monitor, and at the appropriate time call you out of muteness to speak. Please consider your use of language, that your words be respectful, as no derogatory words, curses, or epithets will be tolerated. Your sensitivity in the civil discourse is requested. Telling the deep stories, Indigenous voices reclaiming their spaces. While Texas won much of its territory from Mexico, its obliteration of its first inhabitants upon it led the United States to never really fully recognize any of their tribal lands. That is changing as we hear many venues and buildings pay tribute, as we did, to the ancestral lands upon which they rest. But the earth is not resting, thanks to its colonizers. Perhaps it is these very ancestors that hold the keys to reclaiming Mother Earth from the clutches of its demise. We are talking today with those reclaiming their heritage, calling us to protect our land, water, and air with the fire of their reclaimed identities, and continuing the wisdom, traditions, and some of the lost stories, the deep stories. Mario Alberto Ramirez is Guacachichichil, I'm not going to say this right, Chichimeca, dance educator and water protector. I met him while teaching ballet in the dance department at the University of Texas. And at that time, I was made aware of the sacred spaces in San Marcos for indigenous populations with his traditional blessing of the head of the department. More on that in a moment. So, Mario, if you will, tell us a bit about your heritage, where and how you were raised, but I think you want to do something else first.
Thank you, Sandra. Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Mario Alberto Olimpoyo Ramirez. I am Huachichil Chichimeca, which stems to my peoples from what is currently known as Northern San Luis Potosí, Mexico. My family has been migrating to these lands of Texas for many generations now. But yes, I would love to open the space up together in the ways that a lot of us indigenous peoples do all together when we're in an event. So if everybody could please point to your east, if everybody knows where your east is. So my east is this way. So wherever the sun comes out of, and then point to your south. My south is this way. And then your west, the north. You're gonna point to the sky and then the earth. So we're gonna, in a sense, send our word or an intention to that direction, right? Each direction has a significant symbol that we could go on forever and talking about, but this is a moment for us to kind of send an intention. A very simple way to do it is if you know someone that lives towards the east, you think about that person. To the south, you think about them. West, etc. So everyone could join me. To the east. Momento. To the south. To the west. To the north. To the sky. And to the earth. Thank you, everybody. So my favorite thing, I teach this to my middle schoolers and high schoolers. So I'm also a dance educator. I'm still currently finishing my U-Teach certification through UT, getting my bachelor's of fine arts in dance and choreography through the University of Texas. And my favorite thing to teach these kids is, or these youth are, do you know someone that lives to the east, to the west, to the north, to the south? And then my favorite thing to share with them is, well, do you know that someone that lives in the sky? And then they start thinking, well, do I know someone that lives in the sky? And then I said, well, do you know someone that lives in the earth? And then that kind of is beginning to kind of, begin to open their minds to how we relate in a more bigger sense, right? So yeah, I am very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on these conversations. Thank you so much for the land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are very important, for a lot of us because they open up the conversation of settler colonialism, right? As a structure rather than a single event, right? A lot of folks think that colonialism was a one thing that happened in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And that is very much not the case. It is an ongoing process that we're all trying to undo altogether. So yes, where would you like me to begin, Sandra?
I just wanted you to tell us a little bit about where you're from in Texas and what brought you here. So just start with that.
Yes. So I'm currently living in what is known as San Marcos, Texas. And I moved to Austin about 7 or 8 years ago for college. And I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas. So in Dallas, Texas, I grew up here all of my life, reconnecting to a lot of indigenous practices that are stemming from what we know as Mexican Americanism or like Latinx identities. But a lot of them were truly those were just identities to cover up the indigenous rooted things that we didn't have the language for at the time. So a lot of the times the only language we knew were these identities that other people were giving us so that we could be identified by other people. So I have been here in Texas and started really working with the communities here because my family's from San Luis Potosi. And we began to kind of begin building a kinship and relationship with my elders, Dr. Garza and Maria Rocha, who are from the Indigenous Cultures Institute here in San Marcos. And we do a lot of work together with youth organizing, teaching the youth about the sacred springs and Yanawana. So Yanawana is the Cualhuitecan word for spirit of the water and water of the spirit. And it's not essentially like this very spiritual thing, but one of my favorite things to do is this is part of the movement that we could do later as well. But everyone take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. That element is what? Air, right? And then everyone kind of touch the warmth of your cheeks, right? That warmth is the fire, right? That warmth is the nice fire that keeps us alive. And then anything that we eat, right? Our actual flesh, right? Touching the flesh of our body, squishing the actual flesh, that is our earth, right? Everything we eat is the earth. And then everyone squish your tongue around your mouth. You feel that outer layer, that's the water. And we all know that we're all about 80 to 90% of water, right? So water is life. Water is life. I began to really connect to water when I went to Standing Rock, went to defend the water against the Permian Highway pipeline back in 2016. And that was probably one of the first times I truly felt the government's hunger for fossil fuels, and came back with a very different understanding of how we as indigenous peoples really mean to all humanity, like the connection of what it is that we're actually doing when we are talking to the water, praying with the water, doing our ceremonies, and why they're so sacred and so have been hidden for such a long time because people don't understand what they mean or what they are. I think so specifically, I'll be talking about my relationship and the Cualhuitecan community here in Texas, which is the ones which are the people in my family. I consider them my family. You know, they have adopted me. We work together all the time. I'm the performance program coordinator for the Indigenous Cultures Institute. You're welcome to Google us on Facebook, or we have a website, indigenouscultures.com, and San Marcos. You can find out all about us. And a lot of the work that we do together is primarily youth work. A lot of the history here in Texas has a lot to do with a lot of Hispanic. Thank you so much, Sandra. Hispanic, Latinx, brown youth who have been here in Texas for a very long time, and their families have been here in Texas. And a lot of them don't know about their indigenous heritage or lineages that have been here for many, many generations. And so, .org.
Okay,
Hi,
thank
Rocha.
you. Yeah.
I didn't know Maria Rocha was here. Hello. And yes, so
So someone else has pointed out that you were part of a performances of Indigenous at the Wimberley Emily Ann Theater. Remember we talked about that. You said you'd come here and you'd performed. Yeah.
Yes, we were on tour for the Yanaguana's Legend of the Bluebonnet. And so it was very fortunate. That's another project that we did. We got to go on tour and show the Yanaguana's Legend of the Bluebonnet play, which is so important for a lot of youth to understand their important role for their community, to really uprise and take these matters into their own hands because their voice is so important. So
Well, that
that's a
was
lot.
the Wimberley players. Actually, somebody's correcting me, but that's wonderful that you've already. So you've had some connections with this community already.
Yes, definitely. And Wimberley has a beautiful springs and river as well too. I'm sure I believe the Blanco River flows through there, and all waters can, all the water that is through the streams and the rivers and our springs here is very important to us because we're all the same water. We all drink the same water. We are all the same water, and that's a very big important indigenous teaching that I hope we can all, at least if nothing else comes together, I hope we all understand that we are all the same water. Um, so yes, back to the youth work. Um, so a lot of the work that we do is, or that I would like to also communicate, is a lot of indigenous peoples are constantly being erased or identified as other things. So that can be Hispanic, Latinx, or even white, due to like papers and schools and the education system.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of that in terms of what I kind of alluded to at the beginning about how when Texas took over Mexico and there came a point where people had to pick one or the other. They had to say they were
Yeah.
Mexican or yeah.
So one of my favorite stories is, so I'm also something what is known as Aztec dance. And in Aztec dance, we have the story that's very similar and pretty much the same story here is you would get put in missions. And in these missions, they would say, you will no longer be Huitlahuac Tonatiuh, you will no longer be your name. They would change your name to Mario, or they would change your name to a different Spanish name. And then Ramirez or Gutierrez or any name that ends with the EZ means you belong to this person. So it wasn't necessarily a form of slavery, but still a form of claiming people. So for example, I'm Ramirez. So along my colonial history, someone who was named Ramiro claimed the peoples of my family back in Mexico. And so that's something that I can't get rid of because it's on my birth certificate. So it's very similar here in Texas. So a lot of different names and peoples can go back in their genealogy, family charts, and find that mission and specific missions here in Texas, find the root of where their families and find who were their colonizers, who were the people that claimed the families. And a lot of these peoples were, a lot of these indigenous peoples we were not able to be federally recognized because a lot of us just looked at us as Mexicans. You're not Native American, you're Mexican, even though they're the same thing. So what they would do is they would push us and literally push us back to Mexico, even though peoples had lived here for many generations. They had their lands, their families, all here in Texas established. And they would say, well, you don't look, someone else would determine you don't look Native American, or you're not Native American. Where's your tribal ID card? And they would send you to Mexico where you had no idea. And that still is very relevant and true to this day in different ways that it happens, right? And a very beautiful thing is, a lot of the work that the Garzas do is, it's very beautiful to see different families who have the last name Flores or Garza, because those names are original Huahuetecan names that were just translated to Spanish. So if anybody has Flores or Garza in that last name, it's most likely that their lineage has Huahuetecan ancestry. So that's a little bit on that.
So tell us a little bit about this ceremony that you did for the head of the dance department, and you brought together the waters from the 4 rivers here because you said this was a sacred. Can you explain that connection? I mean, you talked about water, but just that I know that there are some ancestral ruins as well that go way beyond 400, 600 years. of ancestors at these very sites as well. So can you talk about that?
Yes. So for over 14,000 years, um, we have had a connection to the four sacred springs of Texas. And these 4,000 years, we believe that our ancestors came from the underworld up to this upper world, in a sense that is presented to us to this day by the white shaman panel that is in Comstock, Texas, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in this white shaman panel, we can see the Edwards Aquifer and the four sacred springs and the creation story of our peoples. And so,
So that's
know,
a piece of a petroglyph. It's a painting on in that place. So what are those springs? Can you identify that and tell people?
yes, I was just about to get to that. So those four sacred springs are what is currently known as Barden Springs in Austin, Texas, Aqua Arena Springs, what is currently known in San Marcos, San Pedro Springs in San Antonio, and Comal Springs and New Braunfels, and many more other springs that are being fed from the Edwards Aquifer that we currently don't talk about. But these are the four main sacred springs that we have been traveling to and connecting for over 14,000 years. And in these waters are spring water. So for us, what is the holiest water you can get? Clean water. Clean water, the water you can drink, the water that you can give your children, the water that you can give your nieces and your nephews, the water that you can drink to give life. So in these four sacred springs, if you ever go and visit, you see the abundance of life, the abundance of nature and beauty that comes from these sacred springs, the clearness of the water. And it's so vital for us to protect those four waters. And so that's where we believe when we collect these waters from these four sacred sites, which have been ancient gatherings for us indigenous peoples, we have reverence and we have deep respect for these things, because those four grand teachers, the air, the water, the fire, and the earth, those are extremely grand teachers that we give so much respect, because if it were not for those grand teachers, we would not be alive. We would not have life. And so that's something very much that we give a lot of homage and respect to, is these waters. And I think it's very important to know for a lot of people, because a lot of people don't know about these four sacred springs. A lot of people don't know how to take care of them. And we're all drinking this same water. So that's a little bit on the water. I was able to share that a little bit with my community and my professors, because that's something that I carry from my communities. And I'm very fortunate to share that with my department, with anywhere that I go, whoever I go, because we believe in the saying, with all our relations, right? All of our relations, we are all related. Again, going back to the saying, we're all the same water. So yes,
So,
that's a little bit
so
on that.
that's really lovely. And I wanted to just say also, because of the traditions of your indigenous traditions as well, include dancing. And so how has being a dancer, did it come before it came it's just been a part of your heritage? And so for you to also be getting a degree and being a dance educator, how has it helped you as being kind of a heritage keeper, part of your heritage
Mm.
keeping? You pass this on to other students, or and just embodying that?
Yeah, so as dance has been the guidance of my life. Just as the water has been a guidance for my life, movement and dance has been what has protected me in my life and in my journey. So if it were not for dance, I would not have moved to Texas, or to Austin, my bad. And my family's back in San Luis Potosí, Mexico. We have dance is the normal thing. It's not something that only certain people do or certain people major in. Dance isn't something that like is only for particular people. It's everybody. Everybody understands
Communal.
dancing is the thing.
Yeah, it's a
Uh,
communal life. Yeah.
yeah, and so um, I think I got disconnected from that because a lot of my family is not here in Texas. And so when I reconnected back with my very dear teacher, Evelio Flores, um, he kind of reintroduced that dances for everybody through Aztec dance. And so, here in Texas, we also have one of the few, probably the only powwow that I know of that actually allows Aztec dancers at the powwow, to kind of show that kinship that we've been, in these relationships from north to south all the time. And so that, as a dancer, I understand the movements, I understand the teachings of what it means to carry these things, and to embody them, right? I think movement, so we have all these elements: the water, the air, the fire, the earth. But without movement, these form elements cannot come to life, because movement helps these elements come all together. And so I think, as a dancer, I am learning that currently, because I'm just a student. I'm a student of life. So I think that's
You're a
something that
dancer. You're always a student as a dancer. I mean, you're always in
exactly.
class, right? So it's wonderful that you're also educating and passing on that love, and a movement to the next generation. So I wanted to ask you, kind of maybe a parting question, but um, you kind of alluded a little bit to this earlier, but in our discussion before we came on, just in your knowledge, since there are no real tribes recognized officially by United States government, there's no reservations in Texas because of this whole land grab during that Texas-Mexican War. Um, do you know of the other tribes that are in Texas? I mean, we all are kind of familiar with some, but I think you had a kind of a list of them. And then
Yeah.
I also wonder how you feel when a person wants to talk to you about their Native American roots, namely probably a white person, but I mean, you probably Black people. I mean, I have Cherokee in my lineage somewhere, but how does that make you feel, as an expert? Or do you feel like people assume that you're an expert about that and would, want to talk to you about it? Or um, what, just about those couple of things?
Yes, I would love to talk about it. So, just to name a few of the indigenous communities that are here, are the Tonkawa, the Kickapoo, the Jumano, the Alabama Cauchara, the Coahuiltecans, the Apaches. The Coahuiltecans can also be known as the Tapilam, um, and the Comanche. Um, and those are just to name a few. There are many more communities that I cannot think at the top of my head right now. I don't have the list. Those are just a few that I can remember at the top of my head. Um, and these are communities and peoples that. So my favorite response that I learned from my elders, the Garzas, was that indigenous peoples do not understand identity. Like, there's no such thing as identity. Because in indigenous languages, there is no word for indigenous. We don't have a word for claiming indigenous in Coahuiltecan, or in Nahuatl, or in anything, because at the end of the day, we're just the people. So if the, like, Huachichil Chimeca means the red people. If we go to certain different names and communities, it just goes back to the river people, the muddy water people, the etc. people. So when people are, if people are realizing they have connections back to a certain community and peoples, what are you doing to reconnect with those peoples, and to continue protecting what they have been trying to protect, and having that kinship and relationship with the lands and the waters that they're doing, that they're having in relationship with. A lot of peoples and communities have different things that we have to do to maintain the reciprocity with the earth and the water. And a lot of people look at us really funny, because they're like, why would you go every solstice and equinox to the springs and sing to the water? Why would you sing to water? Water listens to us, and it sounds so crazy, but water contains vibration and memory, and that vibration and memory reflects into us in the water that we drink. Science is barely catching up to indigenous knowledges and teachings, because science is barely able to catch the microscopic change of water molecules changing when you sing beauty or when you speak to it in a very ugly manner. Google it,
Wow.
YouTube it.
Wow. That's
So
really
that's a little bit. So that's just something I want to share with, if you have heritage or connection, my thing wouldn't even be to, I mean, yes, it's important to connect to your family, but at the same time, how are you connecting to the land and to the water? And what are we doing to protect it? And what are the people already here? What is the work that has been done? And how can we continue to move forward together, right?
right.
So
Wonderful.
that, yes.
So just curious, we're going to ask Lynn to kind of open it up, and there's a discussion going on in the chat that's going to be interesting. But I was wondering about, with your kids, when you were teaching this last year, were you having to go outside and dance? Was that, I mean, was there an opportunity there? Did that actually open up more opportunities, or were you guys still didn't get to teach outside? It was all like Zoom.
During the pandemic.
Yeah.
During
you
the pandemic,
were teaching, right? Yeah.
yes. So during the pandemic, we didn't really get to go outside. It was more about how can we get kids moving.
Right. So, but I just, yeah, I guess you can't get on Zoom outside, but I know I did a lot of dancing on my porch.
That's great.
But well, here I'm gonna ask. Thank you so much for all the things that you've shared. There's a ton more you could probably talk about, but we have. I'm gonna ask Lynn Flocky to go ahead and raise some of these questions. So
thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, and maybe some of the comments that have been made.
Yeah, man, Mario, thank you so much. That was amazing. And Sandra, what a great job with your questions. And yes, Carlos has started us off with a very interesting question. I would like for him to ask it.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Mario, over the past conversations, we've had these questions or these observations around micro and macro aggressions that are directed to different groups that we're familiar with. So I'm wondering, what are these sort of macro and micro aggressions that are associated with indigenous people? I know that for a long time, I have found the word, the expression going off the reservation to be offensive. But I'm thinking that there's probably a number of others that we hear and we're not even familiar with, and that we should be calling people out for engaging in those kinds of expressions and terminologies.
Well, so you want him to, I mean, people were typing stuff in, but are there any particular that that have been tossed your way that you've had to address maybe?
Mm-hmm.
Are you asking me?
Yes,
yeah.
we're asking you.
Questions for you.
I think, there's a lot. Redskin is still being used very much. There is, Indian. Indian is still not a correct term. I feel like Indian American can only be used by people who are federally recognized peoples. Indian American is not something you can call somebody else, because Indian American is a federal name that can be used through like paperwork. But that is still a completely offensive word, because we're not Indian. Indians are in India. We are in Turtle Island. So that is a lot. And I can't really think of any terms at the moment other than the ones that everyone's been giving, but I would hope that nobody here is using any of those terms.
I'm sort of offended by even seeing them, but I understand the spirit in which people wrote them down. But just isolated by themselves without any kind of explanation, it looks like somebody is calling you this almost. So my first thought was, oh, what's that? Diane Marion also has a question. Diane, why don't you ask your question? Unmute your, here, can you unmute yourself or should I? Let me see if I can do that.
You can only ask her to.
Okay,
After
I
herself.
asked you to.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, you are.
Okay, my question has been, who particularly was here on the land where a lot of us are right here in Wimberley and the Hill Country? How can we, I just in meditation, I would like to have a connection where I'm sitting. And that's the question. Thank you.
So he named a few things and I'll let him answer that, but there's also a document that's sent out in the chat that has a couple of links about how you can find out whose
Wow.
land you're on according to a map and a zip code or whatever. And so if you'll tap on that link, it pulls up a piece of paper that has a lot of these questions, ways that you can find out. So I
Good,
suggest that you do
good.
that. Carlos is going to put it, you got to scroll to the top of your chat and it's there, but go ahead and answer that, Mario. You did to a certain extent, but I'm not sure if you know exactly who in the Wimberley Valley.
I would definitely say Huahuitecan peoples have definitely been in this area, Central Texas. I think the Huahuitecan peoples have been having deep relationships with the waters here of the Acorina Springs, the Blanco River. And so, and you know, a very beautiful thing is that, you know, we have been in relationship with other communities all the time, and we would migrate. Migrations would happen all the time. So of course there's going to be Comanche, Kickapoo, different peoples and histories probably related to that area as well. So I would say start with one place and then branch out and seeing the peoples that have been here, you know. A lot of us don't have a lot of presence anymore due to gentrification and colonialism and all the things, because we can't live there because we can't afford to live there. But I would start there, definitely, with Huahuitecan's peoples.
And could you maybe spell that to the chat once we move on to the next
Of
person?
course.
Are there any other questions or should we move on, Lynn?
Well, let's see. I'm not sure. Nancy, was that a question or just a comment you made? Let's see. Where are you, Nancy? There
About a
you are.
Japanese artist who has photographed crystals and molecular structure of different types of water in various
We'll
states.
hear Nancy's voice here for a sec. Go ahead and unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
This is an artist who's got a widely circulated catalog of photographs of water in different states of clarity or pollution or whatever. That's very fascinating. And I put in the term Indian giver because I took a course in Oklahoma history a long time ago. And one of the things we learned was that term came from the various treaties that various tribes were either talked into or whatever, and many times did not understand that their land was actually going to be taken. And so when they tried to take it back, they were then called Indian givers. Anyway, that was the history of where that term came from. And I
Yes.
used to hear it as a child.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think a very common story or thread or names that are along with that are like Pocahontas, right? Or the Malinches, which are the peoples who would kind of go back and forth from the indigenous community, from our indigenous communities with the colonizers, right? I think there was a lot of efforts in trying to just provide harmony and relationship and kinship keeping, but for whatever reason, there was a disconnection of, I'm not sure why. People just don't know how to relate and understand that we can all come together. But there's a lot of terms that can still be very offensive. Like, for example, we don't want to be calling anybody Pocahontas. Like, I have some friends who, are dating maybe white men and they're indigenous. And so a lot of people call them Pocahontas. When Pocahontas was very much a young girl who was taken away from her community, raped and kidnapped from her community, right? So it's a very important to know the history of these names and why they originated. So thank you all so much for doing that history and that work to really understand where the root of these names are coming from.
Well, thank you so much for coming today, Mario. And I hope you will be with us till the end of the conversation and certainly ask or make any comments with the next two speakers as well. And we look forward to your augmenting our movement phrase at the end of our time together. Our next speaker is Duane Reedus, who is on the leading edge of executive coaching in the early 1990s, working with domestic and international companies to develop leaders at the C-level over a period of 15 years. Her current focus is leadership development for young entrepreneurs and professionals. With degrees in psychology, business, and organizational behavior, she has had several career turns that have taken her on unexpected paths. She has lived in Wimberley since 2000 and has been active in our local community, serving as an officer on several boards, including the Wimberley Chamber Board, Youth Taking Charge, Wood Creek POA, and Wimberley Valley Watershed Association, as well as Arts from the Heart. We have all heard her distinctive voice on Wimberley Valley Radio, where she is in her 4th year hosting the weekly show On River Time that highlights the wisdom and stories that weave through the Wimberley Valley community. So, Duane, thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone. I'm just so appreciative for this series and that Sandra stepped up and started this Voices at the Table. She and Carlos are doing this fabulous job, and it's very, very meaningful to see how the ripples are already affecting this local community. So the lenses keep changing, and hopefully we're getting more focused as to the reality. But I wanted to talk about a little bit of a timeline in my life. I'm a 5th generation Texan. My father was born in Bochita, Oklahoma, on the Choctaw, in the Choctaw Nation in 1926. And my memory as a young child was at my paternal grandparents' house, and they had a long hallway. And it had a little alcove in the wall where the phone sat. And above that alcove was a landscape picture of indigenous people, Indians, and to a little girl. And when my sister and I looked up and consciously named Indians, which was our perspective, that picture came off the wall and was never seen again. It deeply stirred me. And even as an adult, it still stirs me. And Amy and I both remember the adult conversation that my dad and my grandfather and grandmother had about whether or not to claim their Native American birthright. And my grandfather made the decision not to claim it because of the prevalent stigma and the shame that was pervasive in our culture at the time. And this was the early 1950s. So those two incidents in my young childhood really pulled me forward to understand more about what was missing in that story. I began studying with Navajo and different cultures, the medicine wheel and ancestral customs. I attended powwows in Utah and Georgia and Oklahoma and Texas, including the one at Aqua Springs. I was invited to a 10-day experience in the Utah desert And it was in a neutral space between the Northern Ute and the Southern Ute tribes. And this was their attempt, their invitation to start passing along the stories to those of us who did not understand. And we camped out in the desert for 10 days. I had my tent, it leaked, it rained the whole time. That was part of the learning. But one of the first tasks that we were given was to wake up at sunrise one morning, and they asked us to go out and take a walk and to see what we saw and to come back and share. Well, I found a small fossilized stone. I thought that made me so special. And when I got back and presented that to these chiefs, they looked at me and said, "And what did you return to Mother Earth?" Boom. My heart was touched energetically. And so through that 10 days, we learned a lot. It was mind-blowing. It was an opening. It set me on a path. I did my first sweat lodge, which is ceremony. And it was set up, it was set up in a very natural way, the way they did it on a regular basis. But in that first sweat lodge, I remember I thought I would die. It was like a rebirth that first time. And all I wanted to do was put my head and my hands on the dirt, on the earth, and connect to Mother Earth. That it was as if there was something inside of me was taken to another level of awareness. I lived for 16 years in the Four Corners area. So I've seen many of the petroglyphs of the Navajo and heard the stories and seen the weavings, and it's just always drawn me further and further. A few years later, while I was in Utah, I was invited to go to Cusco, Peru, to meet with Don Americo Yabar, who was the guardian of the Moya Marca tribe, who were the last descendants of the Inca. And they lived high above Cusco, Peru, between 11 and 12,000 feet elevation. They lived just planting potatoes, and there was my Utah experience. We danced, we drummed, we were brought in to understand the medicine wheel, etc. And then we went to Peru, and Don Americo, he had an ancestral home 11,000 feet up that was over 500 years old. These were the Moya Marca villagers who, in their ceremonial way, greeted us with a parade. And they came down in these ceremonial costumes. It was different to them, but greeting us. This was their way of opening their arms to these gringo Americans who were searching. And that journey with Don Americo lasted a period of 7 years between Peru and Utah, where we would set up in the desert again for 10 and 12 days at a time. True to naive American misunderstandings, when we as a group went to Peru, we thought we were doing such a good thing. We took soccer uniforms to give to the young people. And again, we were faced with a reality. They gently and very humbly refused to accept the uniforms with the explanation it would be disrespectful to the other villagers if they were the only ones who had uniforms. Again, the reciprocity, that equanimity, that shared experience, we're all the same. No one is above someone else. So that again brought more awareness into my being. I learned about the energetic languages, the Hucha energy, which was the dark, heavy energy, and the Panya energy, which was the light energy, and how we could communicate and understand energetic connections. Don Americo called them the filaments of connection through the ethers. And the last trip we took to Peru, and we were back up at his ancestral home was called Salkawasi. the wild energy. And that meant undomesticated energy, energy that was raw and natural, the energy that Mario was talking about, the land, the elements. And the last night we were around the fire before ceremony, and Don Americo was an integrated, beautiful, poetic dancer, speaker, communicator. Everything was translated from Quechua, which was the native language, to Spanish to English through the whole time we were there. And I was dancing around the fire, and I had just, something was nagging at me, pulling at me, calling me. And I looked at Don Americo and I said, where is the shamama? Where is the feminine? You have not talked in words that I could understand about the feminine, even though it was woven into his language. And that word came out of my mouth. But for the importance of that was, for the first time in history, he allowed the women of the village to lead ceremony. He said, it's time for the weaving of the male and the feminine. And it's that time was coming in. So this was 20 years ago. And he said, yes, that's what's coming next. So then finally, I want to share from, this was my great-grandfather's book. I don't know why I'm not in speaker view, but.
I can see it.
Okay. And the name of the book is 5 Years a Cavalryman, Sketches of Regular Army Life of the Texas Frontier, 1866 to 1871 by H.H. Harry Hall McConnell. And in his first chapter, this was my maternal side of my history. And for the first time in his first chapter of the book, this was first published in 1889 in Jacksboro, Texas, and later republished by the Oklahoma University Press in 1996. And he came from Pennsylvania. His father was a physician. He was well educated, but he wrote in chapter 1, the motives that may have induced me to place myself in so unenviable a position as a recruit in the ranks of the Army are not pertinent to these sketches and need not be entered into. We don't really know why he chose to do this, except the West was calling. So Western Frontier was wide open. And besides writing in this book about the settlement of how the West was being settled and the skirmishes and the conflict with the native peoples, he wrote beautiful descriptions all the way from the Red River down San Antonio, all through Austin in this area. But what was important to me in his writing, he talked a lot about the different tribes. And there was a famous trial that happened. General Sherman had been sent by Washington to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to deal with Indians. You know, what are we going to do about this, all these skirmishes? And so he was sent out there, and they had captured 4 Kiowa chiefs. One was Satana, Santank, Kicking Bird, and Lone Wolf. And they were made to walk all the way from Fort Sill to Fort Richardson, which is outside of Jacksboro, which is outside west of Fort Worth. And they were sentenced to death by an all-male, of course, jury. They were treated as heathens. Then they were incarcerated in Huntsville. And then Texas Governor Davis commuted their sentences, and they were set free. But Satana, I don't know, I always thought it was Santana, but it's not. It has an extra T. Satanta was re-incarcerated in Huntsville and later killed himself by leaping from a high wall in prison. But I wanted to read his last speech that was translated.
How long is it?
Like a minute.
Okay, great. Because we want to start taking some questions.
The harangue was spoken in the Comanche tongue, that being the dominant vernacular among the Indians of the plains. The chief was handcuffed at the time of his speech, was delivered semi-signal, semi-oral, so to speak. And he said, "I cannot speak with these things upon my wrists," holding up his arms to show the iron bracelets. "I'm a squaw. Has anybody heard from the Great Father, from the great sky? I've never been so near Tejanas, Texans before. I look around me and see your braves, squaws, papooses, and I've said in my heart that if I ever get back to my people, I will never make war upon you. I've always been the friend of the white man, ever since I was so high, indicating by sign the height of a boy. My tribe has haunted me and called me a squaw because I've been the friend of the Tehuanas. I'm suffering now for the crimes of bad Indians." And he named some. "I did not kill the Tehuanas. I came down the Peace River as a big medicine man to doctor the wounds of the braves. I am a chief among my people. I have great influence among the warriors of my tribe. They know my voice and will hear my word. If you let me go back to my people, I will withdraw my warriors from Tehiana. I will take them all across the Red River, and that shall be the line between us and the palefaces. I will wash out the spots of blood and make it a white land, and there shall be peace, and the Tehuanas may plow and drive their oxen to the river. But if you kill me, it will be a spark on the prairie, make a big fire, burn heap." So that was the translation. And the fort was eventually closed. They took down the last flags in 1879. And the people who had been buried there were taken to the National Cemetery in San Antonio.
Wow. Wow, that's a lot of history that you've acquired and learned, and traditions that you've followed and made part of who you are. Really wonderful. Thank you for sharing all that, Duane. Are there any questions for Duane, Lynn? Or I think people have made comments about the
Yeah, I think I just unmuted Martha. Martha, unmute yourself, Martha, and ask your question. She's made a couple of good comments, and I wanted her to come in.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
yes.
yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, because my camera's not working. But one comment was the book, Indian Givers. It's a really wonderful book, and it tells about how we in this country are not really aware of countless gifts from our Native Americans. And it's just such a fascinating book. I think everyone should read it. Jack Weatherford is the author.
Okay.
The other comment was to Duane, I'd love to talk to you some more. I actually got to study a little bit with Don Americo at a workshop in Central America, and actually in Mexico. And so I'd love to hear more stories about him. He's such an amazing person.
Yes, he's
And
traveled
thank you.
internationally, globally.
Yes, thank you so much, Sandra and Carlos, for this gift to our community.
Well, certainly. Well, thank you, Duane. I'm gonna move on to our next discussion. I think you could probably respond to one another in the chat. So you girls get to talking, okay? Okay, so I'm gonna move on if I can get to my notes here. Thank you again, Duane, for speaking with us. Stephanie Nesselrode is a social worker dedicated to social justice and a strategic planner focused on creating a world that works for all. She's been active in Wimberley Valley politics and dedicates time to supporting Wimberley's young, talented activists. Leading the effort to create the Martha Nees Community Park reflected her commitment to honoring Wimberley's elders. As founders of Seventh Generation Labs, she's currently focused on creating a curated set of indigenous wisdoms for peaceful coexistence. Welcome to the table, Stephanie. Maybe you can tell us briefly how you came to encounter your indigeneity and how you came to Wimberley.
Oh gosh, those are both big questions. But first, I want to thank Duane. Duane, I just love it how you gently urge us all out into our learning edges. What a contribution you made to this conversation. And Mario made an excellent point that I'd like to start with, and that is I believe that if every one of us look for personal to us things that we could do to promote indigenous culture and the history, we would all find ways to do that. My sister happened to be the head of the water department in San Francisco, and I happened to ask her. I said, she's big in the International Water Association. I said, have they ever had an indigenous person come talk about the sacred nature of water, because she believes that as well? And she said, no, we've never had an indigenous speaker. And I was able to introduce her to Dave Archibald, who was chairman at Standing Rock during the protests that Mario was fortunate enough to attend, and she got him to be a speaker at the next World Conference. And now my sister's written a book on sustainable industrial water use aimed at people in the water industry. And she had Dave write the very first chapter of the book, and the name of it is The Indigenous Perspective on Water, a Source of Life, Not a Resource. So anyway, this is just my example of how if every one of us looked for a unique way to get involved, we could be. So I just want to very quickly talk about being from Oklahoma. Oklahoma was mentioned several times. This is actually the Oklahoma state flag, and on the back of it, it says, Oklahoma state flag honors more than 60 groups of Native Americans and their ancestors. The center of the shield is the battle shield of an Osage warrior. So what impact did being from Oklahoma had? Well, for one, in Oklahoma history, we were learning about the 5 civilized tribes because, as has been pointed out, this takeover of land has gone on for generations and generations. And it's important to remember that they estimate between 100 and 120 million people have died as a result of the colonies expanding out and ever outward. And so, as was mentioned earlier, there's a handout at the top of the chat box, and the first resource on there is a film that traces the whole history of indigenous things that we're talking about today, and it's a great overview for people. But being from Oklahoma, I was born in northwest Oklahoma in the part that German and Swiss settlers settled in because my father was Swiss and German. But my grandparents on my mother's side lived in what had been Cherokee country in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And so when we would visit them in the summer especially, they would take us to powwows. And I never thought too much about it because who wouldn't want to go to a powwow? But when I was over 50, my mother shared to me that her father had roots with Cherokee relations. And it was, as was mentioned with Duane, something that the family hid. I mean, I don't think people realize the impact of declaring yourself Indian had. If you were declared Indian, your kids were stolen away to be in Indian schools. So the whole history of hiding part of your heritage is a very sad thing to me, so I didn't run across that, and whether or not it's just a family story or otherwise, I don't know, but I've always been drawn to Native cultures. And as I thought about my Swiss German heritage, I also realized that my grandparents didn't speak German in their house because they wanted their children to assimilate to this culture, and because of 2 world wars with Germans, they didn't want to be recognized as German. So it's such a sad commentary that so many people in the world have felt compelled to hide part of their identity. And especially, as Mario was saying, most indigenous people, they call themselves the people, the strong people. They just focus on the fact they're people. So going back to Oklahoma, as white people continued to take land on the East Coast, starting in New York, all the way by the time 1825 came, Andrew Jackson ended up declaring that they needed to reshuffle things again so that they could force Indians to move west of the Mississippi River, declaring that Indians would own that land forever. And in 1830, the Trail of Tears continued, and that went on for 8 years, even though towards the end, the Supreme Court of the United States declared that the Trail of Tears was an illegal thing to do. And interestingly enough, just last year, the Supreme Court ended up recognizing that about half the land in Oklahoma is actually native land. So how that's going to land, I don't know. But that establishment of the 5 civilized tribes came to a major change, less than 60 years later in 1889, where they declared that 2 million acres in Oklahoma was now going to be part of the Oklahoma Land Rush. And my husband's family was participated in that white land rush. So again, the stories of people continue to intersect. And so fortunately for me, I, in the late 1890s, got introduced to 2 teachers who taught indigenous wisdom. The first was Paula Underwood. This is exactly the brochure I got in the mail back in the late 90s. And it was talking about learn what kind of learner you are and how to adapt your learning style to the needs and requirements of a changing world. Who wouldn't want to learn those things? So I got to know Paula, and she was the keeper of a 10,000-year-old oral history of people who were in Southeast Asia when they were hit by an earthquake followed by a tsunami. And all of their wisdom keepers died in a flash. And they made 2 decisions after that happening. One is they say this is not a very good system. If all of our wisdom can get gone in a flash, we're going to become a learning people who everybody knows our collective wisdom. And the second was they decided they needed to find a friendlier ocean. And so they crossed the Bering Straits even as they were starting to sink. They came into what is now the United States. They crossed the Rocky Mountains. They landed in New York and the Great Lakes. That took them 10,000 years. But they decided to stay, even though some, people were using it for hunting grounds. So that's another interesting story, but I won't get off on that. But they became the Oneida, which are one of the 5 nations that formed the Iroquois Confederacy over 800 years ago. It is the oldest living participatory democracy in the world, and our Constitution in the United States was based on their model of governance. And that's because Benjamin Franklin was very good friends with people of the Oneida. So during the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin would keep the window open so that the Oneida chief was able to be there and hear the proceedings of what happened during the day, and he would try to coach Benjamin Franklin in the evening to see how far he could get. And unfortunately, Benjamin Franklin did the best he could, but there were critical things that were in the Iroquois Confederacy that did not make it into the U.S. Constitution. And one was the rights of women, the rights of children, the rights of people of color, and the rights of Mother Earth herself. And what Benjamin Franklin had to tell these Native peoples is that it was the best deal he could get. He basically concluded that either they could start an imperfect union, and you'll notice in our documents it says we are an imperfect union, and he knew that future generations were going to have to fix it. So anyway, one of Paula's books actually tells the story, and all of this is in that handout, about how the Oneida, these learning people, really worked very hard to get our Constitution to be more like theirs. And by the way, the first women's suffragette convention was in Seneca Falls in 1848, And it was at that location because that was like adjacent to the Iroquois Confederacy. And these women, these suffragettes, spent time talking to Iroquois women who had been having major influence in their government for hundreds of years. So think about it, 1848, mainly white women were going to indigenous women to find out how it is they had such a strong role in government. Unfortunately, American women did not get the vote until 1920. And also, unfortunately, even though Iroquois helped feed George Washington at Valley Forge, that's one reason they didn't starve totally to death. Once he was president, he really was involved in a lot of land grabs of Indian territories. And by the early 1800s, the wisdom keeper of the old things that Paula inherited realized that she was in a problem because at a council meeting they were moving towards a decision that to be more recognizable to the U.S. government and to try and get along, they were going to get rid of the way they did democracy and adopt the American style to become more recognizable. So she knew what that meant because they started planning a ceremony where they would officially like burn the old things that related to that system in a fire. And who knows what was that going to mean for her situation. So she snuck out of that meeting, and she was followed by her fiance who helped fend people off who were chasing after her, and Quakers that lived near to the Confederacy that they had good relationships with hid her in the attic. And she told them that she was going to have to leave her people because of this decision they were making. And so they hid her, and when her people from the group came to find her, the Quakers were able to say honestly, there is no one of your people here. And the next day, one of the Quaker sons took this young woman and they traveled to Illinois and settled among Quakers. And so, as this woman, whose name was Bright Spring, the plan was for her daughter to be the next keeper of the old things, but her daughter died young in childbirth and was not available for this chore. So Paula Underwood's grandfather, who was a white Quaker, was adopted by Bright Spring so that he could be the keeper of the old things. So Paula Underwood's family story is a wonderful one of interracial ability to come together to share and to maintain these indigenous wisdoms. So I think it's a very powerful story. And when they became the Confederacy, they adopted the Great Law of Peace, and that's really the North Star for me. It says, in all our decisions, we need to honor the contributions of the past 7 generations and consider the consequences for the next 7 generations. And it was the first part of that that gave me the idea of creating a park for Martha Neese in order to honor her contributions to the valley. So, by the way, Robbie Robertson is also an Iroquois, and he wrote this children's book for the same story.
Wow.
And I want to share one last teacher, and then I'll open it for questions. I also had the privilege of being a student of Tu Moonwalker, an Apache person, and her great-grandfather joined Geronimo during that. So it's been an honor to understand the thinking of the Apache when they made that decision, because what happened from their point of view, every being, not just people, but every being has a right to be, even if you don't like them or whatever. But the bottom line is, if you take away another being's right to be, you get rid of your own right to be. And after multiple broken treaties, what Geronimo said, these white people are never going to let the Apache be Apache. He said, I'd rather be dead. And that's when he went on the war path, because from his point of view, white people had given up their right to be. And Ms. Tu also has a book. And one of the interesting things about her book is it talks about universal laws and principles. And what I have found different about indigenous thought versus Western thought is they figured out centuries ago that if they didn't give people the right to be, it led to war, continuous war. And in the Iroquois situation, that warfare had gone on for so long that some people had even become cannibals. So when we think we're in a really bad place, they were in an even worse place. But out of that misery, they were able to create the oldest participatory democracy in the world. So anyway, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. There is one good news story from Fredericksburg, Texas, and that's also in that handout. The Fredericksburg people were German and they were very practical. And they said, you know, this isn't going to go well if we can't figure out how to live in peace with the Apaches. And they struck a treaty with them that was one of the few treaties that ever held. You know, so, I mean, that's a great story come out of Texas. And the last one is Crazy Horse in 1877 said it was the 7th generation from the time of Wounded Knee that young people would rise up and make things work out across the whole races. And we see that happening in the Wimberley Valley. So that's what I wanted to cover.
Well, thank you so much for that. All of that knowledge about the Iroquois and their contribution to our democracy. And, you know, they had it better than we got it. we spent 400 years trying to get those little tenants they could have gotten in from a first shot. Are there any questions there in the chat?
Yeah, there are some interesting conversations. I just wanted to say to Stephanie, thank you so much for talking about the compact. As you know, who was it recently said in the news? The Native Americans have contributed zilch.
Yeah, that was Rick Santorum.
Yes, and there was an article that I put in our table discussion about that.
Nothing, maybe the Constitution. And by the way, that compact was signed on the shores of Onondaga Lake, which is right in the middle of the 5 tribes. I lived for 25 years in Syracuse, right there, taught at the university there, and one of the Oneida, a performing artist, a singer-songwriter named Joanne Shenandoah, who is wonderful, and I know her. I drive around playing her music. We've actually played her music on Wimberley Valley Radio. I just want you to know.
Wonderful.
She is of the Wolf Clan of the Oneida, and one of the five Iroquois tribes. So people think about reservations out west, but they are in the east too, the Oneida and the Onondaga and the Seneca and so on. So yes, we have a great somebody's from Utica. Shout out to Utica. Okay, Deb. We have a good conversation going between Susan Raybuck and Carlos Solis. So Carlos, why don't you start us off with your question, and Susan has an answer.
Yeah, it occurred to me when I was listening to this that, for example, in Guatemala, when the Spanish, took over the country, they engaged in this systematic destruction of all records, particularly written ones. But a lot of our culture, a lot of our records were destroyed, and a lot of them were burned. And at the end of the day, there was this whole series of manuscripts that were burned, and only 3 survived. And in a way, like Susan points out, a lot of them, those 3 ended up in museums in Europe. So we did not even, of whatever survived with it, we were not the keepers of our own records. So similarly, I was asking whether or not there are accounts of this sort of systematic destruction of records and narratives and history that pertains to Native Americans in the United States.
Well, just the removal of artifacts to museums and the constant collection of Native American spearheads and arrowheads and just, without any regard to the people who were there before, but just, oh, this is interesting. I have the right to take it. I found it, finders keepers kind of an attitude. And then the removal of human remains to museums, the looking down, they would not have done that with people of their own race and color. It was the difference, that their perceived difference in the cultures. I was really struck by Mr. Ramirez's point about the fact that Texas has assumed that indigenous people were Mexican Americans. And I don't know why it never occurred to me before he spoke about that is absolutely true. But that, they are indigenous in a way. I knew that, of course, that Texas was settled way before white people got here, that we were late settlers, and I've always been disturbed about the disrespect for people of color who were on the land here, but that was very interesting. I had heard a talk at the U.S. Institute for on the status of women and about all of the killings and rapes of indigenous women. The people who were reporting them were from tribes up north. And I just wonder, with our Texas erasure of the tribes here and subsuming them into this idea that they are all Mexican American, I wonder what we don't know yet, there.
I worked with an Aztec school in Denver, and one of their teachers told me, she introduced the notions to her students that they were part Native Americans, which they had never thought of themselves. And she said, think about it. Cortez came to this area with men only. What do you think happened after that point? I thought that was a good way to put it. And also, as far as written artifacts, what Paula Underwood carried is that 10,000-year-old oral history, and there is a book that captures it. She was the first person to write it down. And Black Elk himself was the person who said it would be her generation to actually write it down. So it didn't exist anywhere written ever until she published this book. But she said that there were 3 bundles of major wisdom from her people, and that 2 were totally lost because they couldn't find the wisdom keepers to carry them on. To learn it was difficult, and that only her 3rd survived. But it didn't get written down till much later.
Mario, do you have anything you'd like to say to that or comment? And then we're going to tie things up here.
What was the question?
Oh, we were just talking about this, the whole erasure of records and oral histories, and I just wondered how you felt about that discussion.
Yes. So there's a lot of things that are erased, but there are a lot of things that survived as well. So while many books and records have been, I don't want it to end so heavy. That's just part of who I am. But there's a lot of things that have survived, and a lot of things that currently still live within our families. That can be through our food, that can be through our celebrations, many traditions like different parties. There's something called quinceañeras that a lot of Mexican folk do, that are rooted in a lot of Spanish things, but also have very deep indigenous things of a person with a womb or a female coming to their into learning about their moon cycles, right? That's another thing. So I just want to encourage also, like, while there was a lot of things that were lost, there's a lot of things that also survive within our DNA and within our families and traditions.
And when is are you guys going to have the powwow this year? Do you have a date set for that?
Yes, it will be in November, I believe. It will be virtual again. So we prepared for it to be virtual. So it will be coming up. You can find more details on the website.
Okay. And thank you for putting that information in the chat. So as always, thank you to all our speakers. And as always, we end with a movement segment. And I wanted to do a little reviewing of what we've done so far. So maybe, Carlos, you make sure that you can do a screen grab and we can just see everybody doing these moves with me. But for those of you that have been here every time, we started out with this movement, which was based on the MLK's quote about injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And then the second time we actually did the same thing. I think we did it to I'm thinking another quote. So we'll just do that again. It's that. And we did this, broke that, we have justice, and we pray for peace. And then I think the second one we did was we leaned in to the screen. This was for seen and unseen so we could see. And then we put our hand up and we leaned back. And then we did a little ear thing. So this is a part of you can hear things and hear voices, or you could not hear them, or you can unhear them and unlearn them. And then for the Asian and American influences that we talked about generations. So we said there's the first generation, there's the second generation, and there's the third generation. And we talked about we need to be all one people. So the we sign and go out to the world. So that's our dance so far. So now Mario is going to bring us around to something for our final, for this session. So if you would introduce that to us, hopefully it's within the screen. And turn on your
Let's do the 4 elements. So let's start with a deep breath in. We could even do like tense, like you could tense your shoulders and then untense your shoulder to release a exhale, right? So inhale, that's the air. Then we'll do then let's do fire. So we'll do a nice rubbing of hands, right? To create that fire.
Yeah.
And then let's do earth. So we kind of, so from our hands, we do the earth, spread that fire on your body, earth. And then a silly one, water. So you get to move your tongue around your mouth.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for all of my speakers, especially for that dancing moment at the end. I feel like to embody these things, we're going to remember this. And next month, we will indeed be talking about putting all of those movements into a dance together on the screen. And we will be celebrating Juneteenth. So Juneteenth will have been the day before and celebrated all over. And I will be sending you information about virtual and in-person celebrations of Juneteenth around the area. And I had hoped that we might get together, but my husband just said, no, it's not happening. So we will be on Zoom again, but we will be talking about Juneteenth and have someone come forward and speak with us about, a couple of people talk about that. And then we're going to talk about things you've learned from this series. So be thinking about that. And you might also get a little poll or survey from us on your email, just to discuss what are the things that you would like to see going forward, because as I said on a speech the other day to someone, I've held the space. I brought people together and voices that maybe you haven't heard from. So what have you learned and what are you taking forward in your life personally as a practice? And what are things that we could take together as a community? But for me, as a Black woman, I'm here to hold the space for you. But now for most of you who are white, it is your turn to take it and do something action oriented with this, because so many times I've gotten responses from people and there's not enough getting done. That's not on me to do. This is your work to do. And so be thinking about ways that we can come together as a community, and that you've already found to come together as individuals to see people differently, to treat your neighbor with more respect, and to learn a little bit more and lean in and listen to those voices you haven't heard. So thank you very much. And this 6 o'clock on the dot, and we're done. And there'll be there'll be the recording that goes out in a few weeks, if you want, a few days actually. I have a dog here that's just going nuts now. So